It all began in a Wichita jail, is a phrase that isn't said very often. What began in a Wichita jail is the story of a magician and a card cheat, and it involves pool halls, jail cells, rigged dice, marked cards, thimble rigging, napping a yak, pinching a snide, smashing a rag, moonshine, Harry Houdini, legendary public enemies, Pretty Boy Floyd, and Alvin Creepy Carpus. Beautiful prostitutes. A crooked saloon keeper named Midnight, the Ku Klux Klan, Ford Model Ts, bagmen, mechanics, fixers, mobsters, strippers, and a man with no legs named Peg who kept a Colt 45 revolver tucked in his trousers and pole vaulted cars using nothing but his crutches. Unfortunately, to keep this talk under 10 minutes, I won't be talking about any of that. 11 years ago, I used those exact words to open one of the very first odd salons. So now, 11 years later, how about I actually tell that story? Our story begins, as all the great ones do, in a small town in rural Missouri named Pleasant Hill. A young man named Alan Kennedy had just finished playing a game of dice with his friends when he walked to the local diner to buy a slice of pie. As he went to pay for the pie, his dice stumbled out onto the counter, and the diner owner, furious, lectured the young Kennedy on the dangers of gambling. And just to prove a point on how dangerous it could be, to show how dice could be manipulated, he grabbed Kennedy's dice, threw them in a cup, and he rolled a 2. Then a 3, then a 4, and a 5, and a 6, all the way up through 12. That's what someone who knows what they can do to you, he told Kennedy. While this demonstration may have been intended to warn Kennedy off of gambling, it had the exact opposite effect. Kennedy became obsessed, first with dice and later with his true calling, cards. Kennedy quickly became so good at manipulating cards that he was able to quit his legitimate job and cheat at cards full time. There he met a crooked saloon keeper named Midnight Underwood, and Midnight, ever gregarious, would lure the suckers in, and Kennedy would quietly and secretly cheat them out of their money. They did this for years. During this time, Kennedy became a master, an artist, and to those who knew what he was doing, the greatest sleight-of-hand artist in the country. But sometime around 1927, right on the eve of the Great Depression, Kennedy started to imagine something new. Something that, if perfected, would give him the edge over every other card cheat in history. There was just one small problem with his idea. It was impossible. To understand Kennedy's idea, we first have to go back to the gambling world of the early 20th century. If I wanted to false deal, say deal 4 aces off the bottom of the deck, where they're pretty accessible, in any standard poker game, I would first have to pass the cards to the person on my right, and they would get to cut the cards. That would move the aces from the bottom of the deck to the middle of the deck, where they're way less accessible. So in order to deal cards off the bottom, you would first have to somehow nullify the cut. One of the most influential card cheats of all time wrote, "The greatest obstacle in the path of the lone player is the cut. It is the bête noire of his existence. Though he may run up a hand, however cleverly, if it were not for this mere formality, his deal would mean the money. Though he may run up a hand, however cleverly, the cut sends him to sea again." Cheaters work constantly to get around the cut. Kennedy's idea rested in this fact. What he wanted was to let the cut happen legitimately and then somehow deal whatever card he wanted from the middle of the deck. To any card cheat or a magician, even finding a card in the middle of the deck took some level of skill. Dealing one was unheard of. No one had done this before. And Kennedy, whose job was to cheat people, had to do it secretly. Whatever he did had to look perfect, because if he messed up, best case scenario, he loses his job. Worst case scenario, murder. So, Kennedy began to practice, and practice, and practice for 5 years. And after 5 years, he had it. He had invented the center deal. Now, Kennedy never actually showed any of his friends how to do the center deal, but he did show that it was possible to some of his closest friends, including one card sharp who just 2 weeks later was arrested on murder charges and placed into a cell in a Wichita jail. Which is why it all began in a Wichita jail. Rumors of Kennedy's masterpiece started to trickle out of that jail cell, where they caught the attention of the world-renowned magician Dai Vernon. Dai Vernon was perhaps the only magician obsessive enough to dedicate 5 years of his life to a magic trick like Kennedy had, and he was definitely the only magician crazy enough to think that something like the center deal was actually possible. As a testament to his obsessive nature, his own son once said, "As a father, he was a great magician." This obsessive quality of Vernon was why, when he received a letter from a colleague that said, "Out west somewhere there's a man who can deal from the center of the deck," Vernon packed up his earthly belongings in the middle of the Great Depression and left for the West in search of this mythical card cheat. That journey brought him to a jail cell in Wichita where he met Amador Villaseñor, the card cheat who had seen Kennedy's center deal. Villaseñor, like all card cheats, was not going to give up information easily. In fact, the only piece of information that he let slip to Vernon was that he had seen the cheat somewhere in Kansas City. But even that piece of information wasn't really helpful. Kansas City was rife with cheaters and gamblers and mobsters. Finding one card cheat was like finding a needle in a stack of needles. But Kennedy, Vernon, undeterred with very little money, set off for Kansas City. And he realized that to get mobsters and card cheats to give him information, he couldn't just show up and say, "Hey, I'm a magician, show me what you got." Instead, he had to devise some sort of a scheme to trick them into telling them his tricks. And so his scheme began, what if I played the role of the crooked gambler? I will dress in my finest, I will rent expensive cars and wear expensive jewelry, none of which I can afford, and I will play the role of the crooked ocean liner gambler. Shockingly, this trip did not go well. Everyone laughed at Vernon when he brought up the idea of the center deal. That's impossible, they would say. No one would do that. There are way easier ways to cheat people out of their money. Even Peg, that mobster with no legs who kept a gun in his underwear and pole vaulted cars on his crutches, he thought that Vernon was crazy for believing this thing was possible. So, a dejected Vernon sought shelter with his friends, his fellow magicians, at a place called Casey Card, where he overheard Old Man Lee, who ran a crooked dice department, say, "I've seen something impossible." Vernon, obsessed, went to Old Man Lee. "Tell me what you got." He leaned on him, leaned on him, leaned on him, until finally Lee cracked and said, yes, I've seen the center deal from a man named Alan Kennedy in Pleasant Hill. Vernon, with just a few dollars to his name, left for Pleasant Hill. Sure, he would find Kennedy soon. But Vernon dramatically underestimated how much Pleasant Hill would protect its own people. Pretty much every encounter he had searching for Alan Kennedy went something like this. Do you know Alan Kennedy? You mean Bill Kennedy? About this high, wears overalls, real good with cards? Yeah. Never heard of him. This happened over and over and over again until Vernon ran out of money. Sitting in his car, dejected, frustrated, he watched as a little girl, maybe 6 or 7, walked out of an ice cream parlor, tripped, and her ice cream fell to the floor. Vernon, ever the gentleman, flipped the young girl a nickel. She went into the store, got a new ice cream cone, and brought it back out, all smiles. Vernon, alone, in his car, bit of a creeper, looked at the girl and said, do you know Alan Kennedy? And the little girl, he lives in the White House at the top of the hill. And that was how how Vernon found Kennedy. Now, when Vernon knocked at Kennedy's door, Kennedy, again, was not going to give this up easily. And perhaps my favorite fact, Vernon playing the role of the ocean liner gambler was what unlocked this. He said, oh, yes, I've heard of you on the ships. And Kennedy, oh, you have? Here's the trick! And he showed Vernon the center deal. And in fact, we owe this discovery of the center deal to why we know about it at all today. Kennedy needed to do this in secret, and it was Vernon decades later who published the trick and how to do it. So I realized that I just spent quite a bit of time to basically tell you all, a dude found another dude. So why should we care? Why should we care about this magician, this card cheat, and this mythical sleight of hand? Well, I would argue it's because the story matters. It's a story about persistence in the face of towering obstacles. It's a story of creativity and craftsmanship. And to me, perhaps most importantly, with my scientific and rational brain, it's a reminder that even in the face of oppressing conditions like those brought on by the Great Depression, that if even for a moment, the impossible can feel possible. Thank you.